I started to cross the river. I lost my footing for a moment and found myself stalled in the middle of the deepest and fastest part of the stream. As I tried to get better footing, the river current swept my feet from underneath me, and I immediately fell, face down, into the river. I was immediately hit with a wave of cold from the water that had been ice merely hours before. I was swept downstream with my pack on. I was underwater and couldn't breathe. I tried unsuccessfully to get a toehold on the river bottom so I could get on my feet. I realized I was in a very serious situation. No one knew where I was. I had no idea what was downstream. Was there a log or a pile of logs and rocks below me that I could get caught up in? Was my gear and my sleeping bag wet? Was I even going to be able to get out of this? Welcome to the Adventure Travel Show podcast. I'm your host, Kit Parks. The intro today was an excerpt I read from an article by the Pacific Crest Trail Association titled, "I Was Swept Away Crossing a River on the Pacific Crest Trail," written by Charles Williams, who I did try to reach out to, but unfortunately was not able to catch up with him prior to this recording. But I will put a link to his very fine article in the show notes and on the website for this episode. Today we're going to be talking about the best practices to help you get across rivers safely. Believe it or not, that's one of the most dangerous things that we do when we're out in the wild. People might be afraid of heights or snakes or bites or the cold or the heat, but what gets us the most is crossing the rivers. So today we're going to learn the best tips of how to do so safely, what we need to look out for ahead of time, what to do if something goes wrong and we slip and fall into the water, and the things that we need to do to give us the best shot at getting to the other side quickly, efficiently, and safely. This is a super important episode that I hope you'll share. So let's get started. Like I said, many hikers are worried about bears, snakes, lightning. And while you should definitely need to know what to do when you encounter these, your greatest risk of injury or worse is crossing rivers without a bridge. Did you know that the number one way that people die in the national parks in the U.S. is from drowning? It's also one of the leading causes of death on the Pacific Coast Trail. And to beat a dead horse, it is the number one way that we harm ourselves when we're out in the wild. Before we begin, let's talk a minute about rivers themselves. Think of the river, it's something that striates into different horizontal currents. So try to picture a cake with different layers, several layers, and each layer, instead of being cake, is a moving current. The top layer, or the icing, is the fastest moving current, while the bottom layer, where your feet are, is the slowest. However, unlike the top icing, the side icing is also slower moving. And so what this means to you is that even though you might have your feet firmly planted on the riverbend, that stronger middle layer of the cake and even that top layer can still carry you away. And that's what happened to Charles in the intro. And another thing you need to remember too is because the sides are slower, you may not realize it until you're out in the middle of the river that it's much faster and much stronger than you thought, even with the tests that we're going to be doing to see whether or not we think it's safe to cross the river. So the things we want to do, even before we even begin our hike, is number one, let's find out what the current water levels are. Were there any recent rains? How big is the snowmelt runoff? You want to check with the parks or the rangers. Ask around with the locals. If you're on the coastal areas, get a tide chart. And when you're deciding whether or not to cross a river, you need to consider the skill level and the comfort level of everyone in your group, because the weakest member sets the tone. And sometimes it's just best to turn around or else wait until the water level subsides and conditions get better. When we get to the river, what's the next thing we want to look at? We want to consider hidden hazards. Submerged rocks and trees can be covered with moss and they're really slippery. So you want to look, if you do slip, what is shortly downstream? Is there going to be a waterfall that you could possibly go over? I have a girlfriend in my hiking group. She lost one of her girlfriends that went over the fall. That's the one that's just after Turtleback Falls, which I have a great photo of me jumping off. It's a great fall. They have a little roped area. You're not supposed to go past that. She was standing on the edge on the other side of that rope, slipped on a rock, and over that waterfall, she plunged to her death. So you want to see what's further downstream. If things go wrong, what could happen to you? If you see there's a waterfall, you may want to go further upstream or possibly even go past it, follow the river and go downstream and go across the river on the downside of the waterfall. Because if you fall and if you slip, you do not want to get carried over that fall. Look for big rapids and boulders. You don't want to slip and get banged up or worse than there. What kind of riverbed are you crossing? Are you looking at algae-covered rocks or sand? Obviously, the algae rocks are going to add more risk, so you need to be especially cautious. And you need to pay attention to where the river is bending, because if you slip and get carried downstream, look to see what's down in that corner, because that's where you're liable to end up. Is it a pile of river debris? If you see a downed tree or bush in the stream, otherwise referred to as a strainer, you always want to stay downstream of that obstacle. Because if you should happen to fall in and hit the strainer, you're going to find out why it's called that. It strains the water, but not the people. It makes you trapped and can suck you under. It's an incredibly dangerous hazard. If you're wearing convertible pants, you want to take off the lower legs. It's going to give you less drag and you won't be as cold when you do get across. And if it's really cold out, consider actually stripping down to your undies so that you can have dry clothes to put on when you reach the other side. If you have true hiking sandals, and by that I mean proper hiking sandals that are strapped securely around your foot and your ankle, you can put those on so your hiking shoes don't get wet. Tie your hiking boots to the back of your pack or drape them around your neck. But remember, they're going to be clunking around and that can often make you a little bit off balance. Sometimes it's safer just to walk through the water rather than boulder jump. You never want to cross a river in flip-flops. The current can easily make them slip off your feet, causing you to slip and fall into the water. And if you think, oh, I'll just go barefoot, that's not a good idea. Think again. You're liable to cut your feet on the rocks and the sticks. You're better off to have wet shoes. And if you have to wear your hiking boots to cross the river, take out the soles so at least they'll be dry on the other side. You can even take off your socks and keep those dry. You want to assess how deep is the river. You don't want to ford any river with water higher than your knees. You might think to yourself, oh, I'm a great swimmer. Still, it's safer, keep the water to your knees or below. Because the current can easily carry you away if you're crossing waist deep or chest deep in the water. Remember that water levels are usually lower in the morning, especially before the sun has a chance to melt more snow if you're in that kind of an environment. And also, if you get up and hike earlier in the day, you're going to be less likely to miss afternoon thunderstorms that can add more water to the rivers. Deeper water that's less than the height of your knees is often safer than shallower but faster moving water. And you can often take your time more in the deeper water. And counterintuitively, should you fall, you're actually more buoyant in deeper water. Consider also the physics of moving water. Water is heavy, and it weighs 62.4 pounds per cubic foot. Water pressure increases with the square of its velocity. Oh yeah, that's really mathy. What does that mean to us? In everyday terms, that means that if the shallow water is moving twice as fast as the deeper water, it's exerting 4 times the force. If it's 10 times faster, then it's 100 times as forceful. Think about that. So that's why the shallower, faster moving water can be more treacherous for you. Rivers change, and so sometimes the trail may not meet the river at the optimal place to cross. When you come to a river, you want to scout out the river up and down for the best place to cross. Avoid turns in the river as the water moves more quickly there. See if there's something risky shortly downstream that would indicate that you shouldn't be crossing there at all. Say the waterfall we talked about that you could tumble over should you slip. Ideally, you want to look for a vantage point above the river so you can get a bird's eye view to make your assessment. Also pay attention to places that you can get out of the river if you do happen to fall. You always want to try to have a backup plan B ahead of time because you're not going to have time to think in all the chaos should you fall in. If there's a bend in the river below, be sure to scout both sides of the river because if you fall, the water may carry you to the bank side that you didn't plan on going to. The water will most likely leave you on the outside of the bend. Remember, you're going to look too to see what is the river depositing at that bend because there's a chance that you could end up there. You want to make sure you can get out. wherever it is that you want to cross. Are there steep banks that they're going to be difficult to get out? You want to be very patient in choosing where to cross and even deciding whether you should indeed cross. Your life might very well depend on that decision. And if you're scouting the sides of the river off the trail for a safer place to cross, you also need to be aware that this includes its own hazards of falling and injury. When you leave the trail, make a good mental note of the trail so you can find your way back. You don't want to get lost. And for that, I'll also refer you to episode number 6 of what to do if you get lost in the woods. Don't forget you got a map. Look at your map. Are there any forks ahead that might have less water? Would they be a better place to cross? You want to check to see how fast the water is moving. You can test the river current by tossing a stick and seeing how long it takes to move down the stream. The current can be really deceptive. If you toss that stick in and that stick moves faster than your walking pace, the current's too strong. Late spring and early summer are when current levels from snowmelt are particularly strong. Remember the icing on the sides of the cake? What you see with your little test is the river at its slowest. Also pay attention to what happens to the stick. If your stick gets snagged or pulled under, that's liable to be what happens to you should you fall. You can tell the shallower water by indications of little rippling water over boulders. Eddies are formed above larger boulders, and they can slow down the water, making for a good place to cross. However, do not cross downstream of large boulders, as you can get caught in some dangerous swirling currents. Likewise, don't cross just downstream of the waterfall, as there are also going to be some currents that can pull you under. You want to choose an exit point on the other side of the stream. Avoid places that you're going to have to scramble up. Remember, you might be pretty tired, and because of that, you might slip and then fall back down to the river. You also don't want to try to climb up some undercut banks. So you're going to look for an exit point on the straight part of the river and not on the bend. And just while we're talking about it too, as you're crossing the river, you want to keep your eye on your exit point. So you've done all your scouting, you've done your prep work, you've done your little test of the water. Now, when you're crossing the river, you've chosen a location. You're going to choose a location where the river's straight, not at the bend. So you've got a straight part of the river. Now what? Now you want to look at the width of the river, because actually the wider part of the river, the current is usually slower moving than the skinnier parts of the river. So you want to look for the wider section. Even though that might look a little bit more intimidating, it's often safer. So you want to think straight, wide, shallow. So the straighter part of the river is going to be less movement. The wider part is less current and shallow below the knees. So straight, wide, and shallow. Only cross it when it's above your knees, when there's little to no current, unless you plan on swimming across the river, which I'll talk about that a little bit later. And the straight stretches too also offer the benefit usually of a consistent current. Be on the lookout for something when the river breaks into channels. They call them braided channels. These channels often have debris, rock sandbars that you can rest on, and on the widest part often dissipates some of the force of the water. A braided channel could be a great place to cross. Also be on the lookout for sandbars where you might see some animal tracks. That's usually a great indicator that that's a good place to cross. The animals know best. So you've chosen your location. You've already scouted everything. Now, make sure you unbuckle your pack, both the hip and the sternum straps, because if you slip, you do not want your pack to drag you under or get caught and then help to drown you. However, now that it's loose, it's going to make your pack a little bit more unstable as the weight shifts about while you're crossing the river. You also want to loosen your shoulder straps a little bit to make it a little bit easier to remove if you do fall. It's better to lose your pack than your life. One option is you can tie your rope to your pack, so if you do fall in, you have a better chance of recovering it. But you still need to be prepared to let go of the rope if the current or snagged pack starts pulling you under. Found your place, you've unbuckled your pack. Number 3, when you enter the water, you want to face upstream and then you shuffle your feet rather than stepping. So you're sliding your feet across the riverbed rather than stepping in a slightly downstream manner at a roughly 45-degree angle. Shuffling rather than lifting your feet is going to help prevent you from slipping on an algae-covered rock or a submerged tree trunk. This will also scoot away any underwater critters that you might accidentally step on and that could spook you, causing you to fall. Number 4, you want to use a trekking pole. Poles are great not just for hiking, especially when going downhill, but they can turn your body into a more stable tripod when crossing a river. If you don't want to carry poles, find a sturdy stick to use when crossing. My poles have saved me countless falls in and out of the water. If you use a hiking pole, then you will always have one foot firmly planted, plus the pole firmly planted as you shuffle the other foot. You face upstream and plant the pole in the stream. The current's going to lodge it into something. And if you find that that small tip keeps getting caught, a sturdy stick might be a better option for you. Remember to only move one foot at a time and don't cross your legs so you can get tangled and tip over. You're shuffling with solid foot placement sideways facing upstream, moving about a 45-degree angle downstream. Face up, move down, slight angle. Remember the tripod. Keep the tripod, and you want to have always 2 solid points of contact on the river floor before moving the third. So you got 2 feet and a stick. 2 of those should always be firmly planted before you move the third. And if the current's not too strong, you might like using both poles or 2 sturdy sticks. But if it's really strong, it's probably going to be all you can do to handle just keeping the one pole under control. And if that little trekking pole basket causes you some drag, you might want to take it off. Number 5, if you're lucky enough to see the bottom of the river, you can look a few steps ahead for smoother bottoms. If the water is silty, toss a rock. Does it make that kerplunk sound? The water might be deeper than you think. And if your rock swims a little bit before it sinks, you might be about to enter some current that's much stronger than you think. Remember the slower moving sides of our cake icing. As you get in the middle, you might find much stronger current. 6, if there's more than one of you, again with your packs loosened, hug each other's waists and form a line and cross the river together in a sideways shuffle. To do so, you want to put the strongest person and position him or her towards the furthest upstream and secure their position with a sturdy pole. When the leader's firmly established, person number 2 hugs the leader's waist, and then person number 3, etc., as you work on down the chain. This leader is creating an eddy like the big boulder we talked about, and it makes it easier for the others behind to follow. So the group working together shuffles across the stream. When your group has the opportunity, you should practice this on shallower, safer streams so you get it down pat when it comes to a little bit deeper, stronger stream. Another group crossing technique uses the people crossing forming themselves into a tripod. The group forms a triangle facing each other with the strongest person entering the water first. They each hold their neighbor's waist with the weaker people away from the points of the triangle. So you want to put them in the middle of the sides. And again, you're usually going to be more stable holding each other's waists rather than their shoulders. The strongest person takes the lead and is the front point of the tripod, breaking the current. Then he or she plants a pole or stick firmly in the ground, and on the leader's count, everyone takes a step together, and once firmly established, the leader calls out another step, and another step. Together, the group diminishes a lot of the current. If you're in a group and people are crossing solo, consider having somebody downstream ready to toss a rope if they fall in. But if the current is so swift that you actually expect people to fall in, perhaps you shouldn't be crossing it in the first place. Sometimes a stronger, more experienced hiker can cross the river, secure a rope on the crossing bank, come back over and secure another rope there so that the group can hold on to the rope for additional support. The strong person, of course, would then go back and collect the rope afterwards. If the rope is strong enough, you can also use the rope as kind of like a zip line to transfer your packs. But caution, caution, caution. Do not tie people together with a rope. If somebody falls in, it could drag down others to a tragic end. If you use a rope, people are just to be holding on to it, not tied to it. and don't wrap your hands even around it. I actually had a girlfriend I grew up with was holding on to the water ski rope, and she wrapped it around her hands, and when she fell, it literally pulled off all of her fingers. So just grab onto it. Don't wrap it around your hands. If you're hiking solo and you're a little dicey, a little twitchy about a river, consider waiting until other hikers come along so that you can forge the river together, and that adds a higher safety level for all of you. If you're crossing and now the water's getting deeper than your knees, think about returning to the bank and trying either a better spot or waiting for the water levels to lower. Some strong swimmers may consider swimming across a river. While not recommended, if you choose to do so, you must choose a deep spot with minimal current. The little current that's there is still going to feel pretty strong. On the Appalachian Trail, folks used to have to ford across the Kennebec River, but there was a tragedy there once when a woman did unfortunately drown. So now there's a ferry system that runs, I believe it's twice a day. I think a guy in a canoe comes and carries you across the river in safety. But before that, for the most part, people had to swim across. The only time I ever had to swim in a river like that was when my sister Terry and I were in Costa Rica rafting the Baquari River. There was this big rock that we jumped off of, and so our instructions were jump off the rock and then swim as fast as we could over to the left bank. And I was shocked at how fast that river was moving. Here we've been rafting in it all morning, and you don't realize the power of that river. And in fact, it was funny. Fortunately, Terry's a fast swimmer because she forgot when she got out to swim to the left bank, and they fortunately threw a rope and all that because apparently some rapids were coming up ahead, but everything was fine. But again, the main thing I want to emphasize is it didn't look like it was moving that fast. But once I was in, I was like, whoa, it was carrying us really fast. And when I got to that bank, I was exhausted. Remember, I had a life jacket on to help me. You can learn about that whole adventure as episode number 15 of the Active Travel Adventures podcast, and I'll put links in the show notes and on the webpage. And the webpage for this will be adventuretravelshowpodcast.com/river. So if you decide you're going to swim across the river, you must also be a very strong swimmer and have thoroughly scouted out the hazards ahead. You're going to need to remove your pack. Consider inflating your mattress pad and using that as a raft for your backpack. Your important stuff you already should have in dry sacks. And then I also line my whole interior of my pack with a heavy-duty compactor trash bag that I twist up, and then I fold it over onto itself and then twist tie that together. That keeps everything nice and dry, although probably not if it gets submerged. So if you've got your important gear like your sleeping bag and all that in dry bags and a compactor bag, you ought to be in pretty good shape, particularly if you use your mattress pad raft. So if you're swimming, you want to choose where you want to land on the other side and do a little bit of mental math to figure out the current and the distance. So you cross aiming upstream. This is called ferrying across a river. So let's say your math calculations are really off. What's the downside for you if you land way further downstream? Remember, look for the hazards. So regardless of whether you're swimming or forging a river, you got to be mindful of hypothermia. If the water's cold, you could be putting yourself at risk. You want to know the signs and treatments, which I'll leave that for a separate episode. Well, we've learned how to shuffle across a river and swim across a river, but one of my all-time favorite ways to get across a stream, very rarely a river, usually just a stream, is taking advantage of the natural features that are available to me. This includes things like boulders and fallen trees. When I think it's safe to do so, I try to keep my feet dry. Using the natural features is great, and like I said, I use it an awful lot, but the most important thing is to think before you go. What is the downside if you shimmy across that tree or walk across that tree or jump boulder to boulder to cross that stream? If you fall in, just a quick second slip of the footwork, what could happen? Are there rocks you could hit your head on? Are there sticks that could impale you? How high above the water are you when you fall? Is there one of those nasty strainers downstream that you could get caught in? And let's talk for a minute about tree bridges. Sometimes you'll see a nice fallen tree going across that stream. You're like, sweet. If it's got tree bark, that's going to give you better traction than a barkless tree, which could be slippery. If you decide to walk across a tree, it's recommended that you walk sideways and keep your eyes moving and not focus on a fixed point, and that'll help you prevent vertigo. And actually, if I come to a tree bridge, I prefer to just scoot on my butt and just shimmy across. If you see a log jam where a bunch of trees are all crammed together and think that that would be a great way to cross, think again, all right? When multiple trees are locked together from flooding, let's say flooding knocked down a whole bunch of dead trees or whatever, it looks stable, but you don't know for sure. And if you jump on it and you put your weight on a tree that turns out it can move, you can slip between them and get stuck. Plus, let's say the trees are upended, so you see these large root balls. They could be another problem. As you grab onto one to get a little bit of balance and all that, that can dislodge a whole bunch of dirt and rocks above you that can fall on top of you. So just avoid those just to be on the safe side. They could be really treacherous. Boulder hopping. This is usually the way that I cross most streams I go in. And this is when you see the rocks on top of the stream and you just kind of tap dance kind of across the river. So this is what I probably use the most. But keep in mind, I have really good balance and I have really good decision making when it comes to foot placement. When I'm hiking, I just intuitively seem to know where to put my feet. Some people don't. So when you're going to boulder hop, pay attention. What's the downside if you misstep or lose your balance? Is it safer to boulder hop or just to slog through the river? Often, slogging through is the safer option. And if they're dissimilar heights, you want to try to jump up to a boulder rather than down because the momentum actually might be a little bit harder to control. Think about it. Gravity might give you a little bit more quote-unquote help than you need. So jumping up, you actually have a little bit more stability. And also, when I'm doing the boulder hopping, I'm doing so on dry boulders that don't have any algae. I try to avoid stepping on submerged boulders because even if they look algae-free, they're usually still a little bit slippery since they've been underwater. And you're already getting your feet wet, so you might as well just shuffle across the riverbed anyway. You think you've done everything right, everything's going great, and you step on this one boulder, but it moves, and in you fall. So what do you do in this or in any of the other things we've talked about today? What do you do if you fall in the river? Number one, you got to be prepared to unload your pack. Yes, I know that hurts painfully. You've already unbuckled and loosened it, right? You do not want your pack to drag you under. I'm sure you listened to episode number 4 about how to pack your backpack. And I know we've already covered how to keep everything all nice and waterproof. So I know you've done that. But let's say you have to drop your pack. You can often find it at the next bend in the river. If not, you could be screwed. So what does that mean for you? Where are you if you lost your pack? Is that a life-threatening situation? Consider that before you cross a river that you're not sure about. But remember, always better your pack than your life. All right, let's say the worst happens. Number 2, there's rapids and you're swept downstream. So what do? You position yourself that your feet are taking the brunt of the initial impact. So your feet are facing downstream. So you got to protect your head. So you want to float on your back with your feet pointing downstream and then try to aim and use your arms and all that to aim for the shore or a calm, shallow area for you to catch your breath and to regroup. And hopefully you'll be able to recover your pack. And here's something else I want you to think about. Let's say you're doing a hike and you're doing an out and back, meaning you have to cross the same river back on your return. Make note of where you crossed and how long it took you to do so you allow plenty of time for your return hike. Don't forget that the river levels and the currents, the speed can change based on the snowmelt and rainfall. So what may have been a nice calm river you crossed today, a few days from now, after heavy rainfall or a lot of snowmelt, could be dangerously impassable upon your return. What's your plan B in case you can't safely cross it for a while? What if you have to stay there for a few days? Do you know where the nearest bridge is and how far it is to get there? The most important thing you need to pack whenever you head outdoors is your brain. So above all, carry your head with you and don't hesitate to call it a hike and turn back. Or delay the crossing. Perhaps it'll be calmer in the morning. My rule of thumb is, if I'm not sure I should cross, that's a pretty darn good indicator that I shouldn't cross. It should be crystal clear to you that it's safe for you to cross. If not, either wait it out or turn back. I put together a checklist of what we talked about today that will be available in the monthly newsletter that goes out to anybody that subscribes, and you can always find how to do that at adventuretravelshowpodcast.com, or you can always email me at kit@activetraveladventures.com. Some parting thoughts. I love the outdoors as much as you do, but we want to do it safely. Have you ever fallen crossing a river? I've been lucky. Actually, I never have. I've fallen lots of times on the trail, but never in a river. So if you have, I'd like to hear what happened to you, and do you think that what we covered today was helpful or would have been helpful for you? Like I said, this is the most dangerous thing that we face when we're out hiking in the wild. So if you have hiking buddies, please make sure that they get a copy of this podcast so that they know what to do. Even if they say, oh, I know everything what to do, there's probably one or two tips here that they didn't know that might be helpful for them in the future. Next up on the show is the big debate. Hiking boots versus hiking shoes. What's the difference? When do you wear what? And how to pick the right shoe for you. And next up on the Active Travel Adventures podcast, I have a very special episode covering a little visited range in the Rockies called the Mummy Range. And after looking at the photos and talking to our guest, I definitely put that on my list. So I'm looking forward to sharing that with you. I appreciate you listening. Until next time, this is Kit Parks. Adventure on!